Have you ever been sitting in church singing a hymn or looking at a Bach chorale in a theory class and thought to yourself, how did we get here? The four-part chorale harmonizations popularized in the 18th century by composers like Bach have become a standard for teaching music theory and for setting hymns in the modern day. While this style is very important to us today, very rarely do we look back and ask, where did it come from? Today we'll look at how the four-part chorale style developed from its origins in chant to the form most common today. It goes without saying, the hymns we use in the 21st century come from many places and times. For the sake of this video, we're going to be looking at two hymns that have their origins in the early 11th century. It is well documented that many of the chorales composed by Luther around the time of the Reformation were derived from Latin Gregorian chants known as sequences. Two of the most famous examples are the chorales Christ lag in Todesbanden and Christ ist erstanden. The melodies of these chorales are derived from the same sequence, the Victimae Paschali Laudes. A quick listen to the three tunes makes these similarities quite obvious.
Victimae Paschali Laudes, Timorem Christiani.
Christ lag in Todesbanden, für unsere Sund gegeben. Christ ist erstanden von der Mater alle.
The melodic contour of the sequence is easily recognizable in both of these chorales. However, at the time of Luther's composition, both of these chorales were monophonic, meaning only one line of music. However, it was only a few years later when Martin Luther teamed up with contemporary Johann Walter in order to set these chorales in four parts. Let's take a listen. These realizations sound nothing like the hymns we know today. Walter's arrangements sound much more similar to the music of Palestrina or other Renaissance composers of the time. Here you can clearly see Luther's original melody in the tenor, accompanied by polyphony in the other three voices. By the 18th century, we see the melody move into the soprano line, where it is accompanied by a largely homophonic texture. These changes actually originated as early as the 16th century as well. Throughout the majority of the Renaissance, music was composed horizontally, meaning the melodic line of each voice was the first priority. However, in the late 16th century, church musicians in Germany sought to increase congregational singing in their churches. This meant their arrangements needed to be more simple and accessible for the congregation. One solution to this problem was to increase the prominence of the melody by moving it to the soprano and to adopt a fully homophonic texture which allowed the whole congregation to move together rhythmically. In 1586, pastor and former organist Lucas Osiander published 50 geistliche Lieder, which translates to 50 spiritual songs, or if you prefer its full title, 50 spiritual songs for four voices set in such a way that the whole congregation can join in them. The complex polyphony of prior chorale motets were replaced with very simple arrangements composed vertically instead of horizontally, meaning the primary focus was the harmony which accompanied each note in the melody. This book inspired many similar collections to be produced in the early 17th century by the likes of Hans Leo Hassler and Melchior Vulpius, who set homophonic chorales for 3, 4, and 5 voices. Let's take a listen to Osiander's setting of Christ lag in Todesbanden. As you can see, this setting is much more similar to the chorales of the 18th century, and in many respects the chorales we study today. The key differences are that Osiander's settings are isorhythmic instead of metric, meaning these chorales do not conform to a time signature, and they are strictly 100% homophonic, lacking the passing tones and other embellishments found in later settings. It is important to note that the motet style of arranging chorales didn't disappear in the 17th century, and it was composers like Michael Pretorius who frequently composed in both styles that began to introduce more embellishments to the homophonic style. The Renaissance motet style arrangements actually grew in popularity over the course of the 17th century, and by the end of the century, the popularity of congregational singing actually decreased dramatically. It wasn't until the early 18th century, when Bach repopularized congregational singing in Leipzig, that these homophonic settings made a return. Bach, who was seen as outdated by contemporaries, was inspired by the music of the early 16th century, and his chorale arrangements were almost always homophonic with added embellishments not dissimilar from those of Pretorius. As a late Baroque-era composer, Bach's chorales were almost always metric and fit nicely in a 4/4 time signature, as was becoming more common at the time. This was the final step towards a chorale tradition that largely resembles the one we have today. Let's take a listen to Bach's setting of Christlagen Todesbanten from the last verse of BWV 4, his cantata of the same name. After Bach's death in 1750, his music fell into obscurity. It wasn't until 1829, when Felix Mendelssohn conducted a version of Bach's St. Matthew Passion, that Bach's music became beloved to the whole of Europe. Many of the chorale settings in modern hymnals are still the same settings which Bach composed nearly 300 years ago. Many more recent harmonizations are still created in the same style, which was not too difficult to recreate given the very strict counterpoint rules Bach adhered to. It is these strict rules of voice leading that were almost never broken that led these chorales to become such strong pedagogical devices, and their prescriptive nature makes them an easy target of emulation for younger musicians who are learning to write counterpoint. Throughout history, the word chorale has had many different meanings. When Luther composed the first chorales, they were practically just German translations of old monophonic chants. Later, when Johann Walter set each of the tunes, chorales became more popular as polyphonic motets. When congregations were first exposed to singing chorales, it was likely through Osiander's isorhythmic and homophonic settings, which brought the melody to the soprano. This type of singing fell out of fashion, and it wasn't until the early 18th century when Bach finally codified the genre. Thank you so much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you next time.